Jean-Paul Sartre's analysis of human relations begins with a claim that runs directly against everyday moral optimism. Conflict is not a breakdown of social life, it is one of its basic conditions. This does not mean that people are naturally cruel, violent, or malicious. It means that when free beings encounter one another, tension is unavoidable. Sartre's claim follows directly from everything that has come before. Consciousness is defined by nothingness. The self is a project rather than a thing. Freedom exists only in situation. The presence of others exposes us through the look. Once these elements are in place, harmony can no longer be assumed. Human relations become a field of struggle over meaning, identity, and control. This struggle does not require hostility. It exists even in the most ordinary interactions. When two people meet, they do not encounter one another as neutral objects. They encounter one another as freedoms, as centers of interpretation, judgment, and negation. Each person wants to remain the source of their own meaning. Each resists being reduced to an object in the other's world. This mutual resistance is the root of conflict. Sartre insists that conflict is not a psychological accident caused by misunderstanding or poor communication. Better communication does not remove the structure. It may clarify intentions, but it does not dissolve the tension between freedoms. Even perfect understanding would not eliminate the problem, because the problem is not ignorance, it is exposure. To be seen by another is to risk being fixed. To see another is to risk fixing them. This risk does not disappear in friendship, love, or cooperation. It simply takes more subtle forms. Sartre therefore rejects accounts of social life that treat conflict as abnormal. For him, harmony is fragile and temporary. Conflict is persistent because it arises from the conditions of existence themselves. One way this conflict appears is through recognition. Human beings want recognition from others. They want to be acknowledged as meaningful, valuable, and real. But recognition is never neutral. To recognize someone is to see them as something. That "as" introduces reduction. When I recognize another person, I necessarily interpret them. I see them as competent, unreliable, admirable, threatening, weak, or worthy of respect. Even positive recognition fixes the other in a certain light. It limits how they can appear. This is why recognition can feel both affirming and constraining. One wants to be seen, but not trapped in the image that seeing produces. Sartre insists that this tension cannot be resolved by goodwill alone. Even the most generous recognition still defines. It still selects. It still freezes certain aspects of the other while ignoring others. The same structure appears in cooperation. Cooperation requires coordination, roles, and expectations. These stabilize behavior, but they also limit freedom. To cooperate is to accept being seen and treated in certain ways. Sartre does not deny the necessity of cooperation. He denies that it eliminates conflict. Cooperation manages conflict, it does not abolish it. Conflict also appears in language. Language allows us to communicate, but it also categorizes. To name something is to fix it. When we describe others, we inevitably reduce them to terms that cannot capture their openness. This reduction is not malicious, it is unavoidable. Sartre insists that even self-description participates in this process. When I describe myself to others, I offer a version of myself that can be grasped, judged, and remembered. That version never coincides with my lived freedom. Human relations therefore oscillate between exposure and defense. We reveal ourselves in order to be recognized, then retreat when recognition feels constraining. We seek closeness, then resent its costs. We want to be understood, then resist being defined. Sartre believes this oscillation is a defining feature of social life. This does not mean that all relations collapse into hostility. It means that relations are unstable. They require ongoing negotiation. They never reach final equilibrium. At this point, Sartre introduces a decisive claim. Conflict is not moral failure, it is ontological tension. To condemn conflict as such is to misunderstand the structure that produces it. This does not excuse cruelty or domination. It explains why they are always possible. Conflict becomes destructive when one freedom attempts to secure itself by eliminating the freedom of the other, by reducing them permanently to an object. Domination, manipulation, and violence are extreme expressions of this impulse. But Sartre insists that even subtle, everyday interactions can carry the same logic in diluted form. The impulse to categorize, to control narratives, to manage appearances, these are mild forms of the same struggle. This analysis forces a difficult recognition. Human relations cannot be purified of conflict without purifying them of freedom. Any social order that promises complete harmony must suppress individuality, interpretation, or agency. Sartre refuses this promise. For him, conflict is the price of taking freedom seriously. A world without conflict would be a world of things, not persons. This is why Sartre's philosophy often feels bleak. It refuses consoling images of social unity. But Sartre would argue that such images are dishonest. They hide the tension that actually structures relations. By the end of this first part, the basic framework should be clear. Conflict arises not because people are bad, but because they are free. Human relations are unstable, not because of moral failure, but because freedom resists fixation. This framework does not yet tell us how to live with conflict. It only tells us why conflict cannot be eliminated without eliminating freedom itself. The next step is unavoidable. Because once conflict is recognized as structural, the question becomes, what forms does it take and how does it escalate? How does everyday tension turn into domination, resentment, and violence? If conflict is structural, then it does not remain abstract, it takes forms. Sartre insists that once human relations are understood as encounters between freedoms, the question is no longer whether conflict exists, but how it is lived and how far it goes. Conflict begins quietly. It begins in interpretation. One person defines another in a way that feels constraining. A look lingers. A tone implies judgment. A role is assumed rather than chosen. These moments are small, but they carry weight. Each one subtly shifts the balance between subject and object. When this balance tips, conflict deepens. One freedom begins to secure itself by fixing the other. The other resists, either openly or internally. What began as tension becomes strategy. Sartre insists that this shift does not require malice. It requires only the desire to stabilize oneself at the expense of another's openness. This is the origin of domination. Domination for Sartre is not first a political category. It is an existential one. It arises whenever one person attempts to turn another into something predictable, manageable, and defined. Power appears when freedom seeks safety by reducing other freedom. This reduction can take many forms. It can be overt, as in command and obedience. It can be subtle, as in manipulation, emotional leverage, or moral pressure. It can be institutional, as in roles that assign fixed functions to individuals. In each case, the structure is the same. One freedom seeks to stabilize itself by limiting another. Sartre insists that domination never fully succeeds. Freedom does not disappear when constrained. It reacts, it resists, reinterprets, withdraws, or simulates compliance. Even obedience contains an inner stance toward what is obeyed. This is why domination is always unstable. It must constantly reinforce itself. It depends on the freedom it seeks to control. If that freedom were truly eliminated, domination would lose its meaning. At the same time, those who are dominated face a temptation of their own. They may accept the role imposed upon them. They may internalize the identity assigned to them. Sartre does not treat this acceptance as simple weakness. He treats it as another strategy for managing conflict. To accept being defined can provide relief. It removes the burden of self-definition. It offers safety at the cost of openness. Sartre insists that this trade-off is chosen, even when it is chosen under pressure. Conflict, therefore, does not divide cleanly into oppressor and victim at the existential level. It is a dynamic in which both sides respond to the same tension, the difficulty of living with freedom. This does not mean Sartre denies injustice. It means he refuses to simplify responsibility. Structural power matters, violence matters, coercion matters, but freedom does not vanish within them. This is why Sartre's analysis becomes uncomfortable. It refuses to allow innocence to reside in position alone. One is not absolved by suffering, and one is not justified by authority. Responsibility attaches to how one lives one's role, not merely to the role itself. Conflict also appears in resentment. When individuals feel fixed by others, but unable to resist openly, resentment accumulates. Sartre sees resentment as a way of reclaiming inner superiority while outwardly complying. It preserves a sense of subjectivity while avoiding confrontation. Resentment, however, does not resolve conflict. It deepens it. It freezes the other into a caricature and the self into a grievance. It replaces action with internal hostility. Sartre treats resentment as a dead end. It neither restores freedom nor transforms relations. It is another way of living conflict without confronting it. The same is true of moralizing. Moral judgment can become a weapon in conflict. By condemning the other, one attempts to assert superiority without altering the structure of the relation. Sartre is deeply suspicious of moral posturing for this reason. It often disguises power struggles as ethical clarity. Conflict escalates further when institutions enter the picture. Institutions stabilize roles, expectations, and hierarchies. They promise order and predictability. But Sartre insists that institutions do not eliminate conflict. They organize it. Within institutions, conflict becomes impersonal. Decisions appear inevitable. Responsibility is dispersed. Individuals act as representatives rather than agents. This diffusion makes conflict more durable and less visible. Sartre believes modern societies are particularly adept at this form of organized conflict. Bureaucracy allows domination without direct confrontation. Violence can be administered through procedures rather than force. At this stage, conflict approaches its most extreme form, violence. Violence, for Sartre, is not merely physical harm. It is the attempt to resolve conflict by eliminating freedom altogether, by treating the other purely as an object to be removed, broken, or silenced. Sartre does not romanticize violence. He treats it as a tragic escalation of the same structure that appears in everyday relations. Violence is what happens when the struggle between freedoms can no longer be managed symbolically. This does not mean violence is inevitable. It means it is intelligible. It emerges from the same logic that governs ordinary social life once pressures intensify. At this point, Sartre's analysis forces a difficult recognition. Conflict is not something that appears only in extreme situations. It is woven into the fabric of human relations. The desire to be free collides with the desire to be secure, and others become both mirrors and obstacles. This recognition does not lead Sartre to cynicism. It leads him to realism. Social life cannot be purified of conflict without purifying it of freedom. Any attempt to abolish conflict entirely would require turning people into things. Sartre refuses that solution. Instead, he insists that conflict must be assumed rather than denied. Denial turns conflict into resentment, domination, or violence. Acknowledgement keeps it visible, negotiable, and fragile. This does not produce harmony, it produces responsibility. By the end of this analysis, conflict appears not as a problem to be solved, but as a condition to be lived with honestly. Human relations are never innocent, never neutral, and never complete. They are arenas in which freedom is constantly at risk. This prepares the ground for Sartre's next move, because once conflict is recognized as structural, the question becomes unavoidable. How should one act within it? How does responsibility extend into relations with others, and what does freedom demand when one's actions affect more than oneself? That question cannot be postponed much longer, but it cannot be answered lightly either.